What if I tell you that there is a man in the Bible who knew more about heaven than the Apostle Paul? A person who traveled through the 7 levels of heaven even before the birth of Christ. A man whose records of fallen angels and the coming judgment were so accurate that one of them, Jesus' own brother, quoted them in the New Testament as prophecy. This man's name was Enoch, and today, few people know his story. This mysterious character lived in the 7th generation from Adam. The Bible speaks of him only a few lines, but these lines sound like a riddle that echoes through thousands of years. And Enoch walked before God, and he did not become, because God took him. It is recorded in the 5th chapter of the book of Genesis. No mention of death, no details of how it happened. It just disappeared. Imagine how these words sounded to ancient readers. In a world where death was the inevitable part of every person, where patriarchs lived for hundreds of years, but eventually died, an exception appears. One person did not know death. His story ends not with a tombstone, but with ascension. What did it mean? Where did he disappear to? And most importantly, what did he see there, where he was taken? Ancient Jewish interpreters could not pass by this riddle. If Enoch was taken alive to God, then he had to receive special knowledge, inaccessible to ordinary mortals. This is how the tradition was born, according to which Enoch became a witness of heavenly secrets, who recorded what he saw in worlds inaccessible to the human eye. This idea was not just a fantasy. There was a clear connection in the thinking of the ancient world. If a person was honored with special proximity to God, then he had to become a bearer of revelation. Enoch became a bridge between earthly and heavenly, a translator of divine secrets into human language. It is this logic that led to the appearance of the texts attributed to Enoch. It is no accident that his name appears more often than any other in pseudo-epigraphic literature. The brevity of the biblical story gave birth to a whole library of devotees, where Enoch appears as the first mystic, the first apocalyptic, the first who dared to look behind the veil that separates the visible world from the invisible. This is how the story of the book begins, which will excite the minds and hearts of truth seekers for centuries. In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd, throwing a stone into a cave, accidentally uncovered one of the greatest archaeological mysteries of the 20th century, the Qumran manuscripts. Among these ancient scrolls, which overturned the ideas of scientists about early Judaism, something amazing was found. 11 copies of the Book of Enoch in Aramaic. This discovery proved what many did not believe. The book really existed in the 3rd to 2nd centuries BC. Until this moment, critics argued that the Book of Enoch is a late Christian forgery. The finds at Qumran shattered this theory. It turned out that Jewish communities carefully copied and studied this text long before the birth of Christ. Moreover, some fragments date back to the 3rd century BC, which makes the Book of Enoch one of the oldest apocalyptic texts in the world. But what was this mysterious book? In fact, a whole library of works created by different authors at different times is hidden under one name. Scholars distinguish 5 main parts: the Book of Watchmen, with its dramatic story about fallen angels; the Book of Proverbs, with messianic prophecies; the Astronomical Book, with cosmological revelations; the Book of Dreams, with symbolic visions of the history of Israel; and the Epistle of Enoch, with moral instructions. Each part reflects the spiritual aspirations of its era. The period of the Second Temple was a time of religious ferment, when Judaism underwent a deep transformation under the influence of Hellenistic culture and political pressure. In this atmosphere of uncertainty, apocalyptic literature offered answers to painful questions. Why do the righteous suffer when divine justice comes? And what fate awaits the world after death? The Book of Enoch has become one of the most influential answers to these eternal questions. When people began to multiply on earth and daughters were born to them, then the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and took them as wives. These mysterious lines from the 6th chapter of Genesis gave rise to one of the most influential and controversial interpretations in the history of religious thought. Who are these sons of God? Modern interpreters cautiously assume that the reference is to the descendants of Seth, the third son of Adam. But the author of the Book of Enoch thought otherwise. For him, these mysterious beings were angels, divine guardians who were supposed to watch over humanity, but instead rebelled against their purpose. Enoch tells their story in astonishing detail. 200 guardian angels, led by Semyaza and Azazel, descended on Mount Hermon, and there swore to each other their loyalty to their rebellion. They didn't just take human wives, they brought to earth knowledge that was never intended for mortals. Azazel taught people how to make weapons and jewelry. Semyaza, spells and magic. Others, astrology, medicine, and literacy. At first glance, this seems like a good thing, because technological progress helps humanity. But Enoch's logic is different. This knowledge did not come at the right time and in the wrong way. They were stolen from heaven instead of being given by God at the right time. The result was chaos. People began to kill each other with advanced weapons, got carried away with magic instead of worshiping the true God, and the union of angels and people gave birth to giant Nephilim who devoured everything in their path. This story explained the origin of evil in a completely new way. Evil came not only from human disobedience in the Garden of Eden, but also from cosmic rebellion in the heavenly spheres. Fallen angels became the source of the corruption that infects the world to this day. Imagine that you are standing on the edge of the abyss between the worlds, and invisible hands are lifting you above the clouds, above the stars, in the sphere where angels live, and the Most High Himself sits. According to the ancient text, this is exactly the kind of journey that Enoch made, and his writings about this experience became one of the most vivid descriptions of mystical ascent in the entire world literature. The Book of Enoch does not simply tell that the seventh from Adam was taken to heaven. She describes in detail the architecture of other worlds with the precision of a geographer exploring an unknown land. Enoch passes through 7 heavenly levels, each of which has its own characteristics, inhabitants, and purpose. He sees deposits of snow and hail, watches the movement of lights, visits gardens where trees of unprecedented beauty grow. But the most amazing thing awaits him in the higher spheres. Enoch appears before the throne of glory, where the Ancient of Days sits. God in His majesty, surrounded by seraphim and cherubim. This description is so powerful that centuries later, it will influence the formation of the Jewish mysticism of the Merkabah and the Christian apocalyptic tradition. It is especially important that Enoch does not just contemplate heavenly mysteries. He receives a mission. He is instructed to write down what he saw for future generations, to become an intermediary between heaven and earth. Moreover, he becomes a witness of the heavenly judgment of the fallen angels, sees how the judgment of the wicked is passed, and receives revelations about the end of time. These descriptions of mystical experience were revolutionary for their time. In an era when access to God was considered the privilege of priests in the temple, The Book of Enoch affirmed the possibility of direct mystical contact with the divine. A righteous person can be taken to the heavenly spheres, can talk with angels, can receive revelations that are inaccessible to religious authorities. This idea made every potential reader a successor of Enoch. Behold, the Lord is coming with the darkness of his holy angels. He will judge all. These solemn words sound from a short message of Judas, the brother of Jesus Christ. But if you look for the source of this quote in the Old Testament, you will not find it in any book, because Jude quotes a completely different text, the Book of Enoch. This is the only direct quote from apocryphal literature in the entire New Testament, and it opens up an amazing picture before us. It turns out that the Lord's brother not only knew the Book of Enoch, but also considered it authoritative enough to support his sermon about the coming judgment with it. He calls Enoch seventh from Adam, exactly the same as it is done in the apocryphal text, and cites his prophecy as unconditional truth. But the influence of the Enochian tradition on the New Testament goes much deeper than a single quote. When Jesus calls himself the Son of Man, and this happens more than 80 times in the Gospels, he uses a title that is elaborated precisely in the Book of Enoch. There we find the image of the eternal Son of Man, who sits on the throne of glory and judges the nations. The apocalyptic visions of John the theologian also bear the imprint of the Enochian tradition. Descriptions of the heavenly throne, books of life, angelic hosts, the final judgment. All this has striking parallels with the text of Enoch. Even the image of the New Jerusalem descending from heaven echoes the Enochian descriptions of the heavenly city. The second epistle of Peter, speaking about the angels who sinned and were imprisoned in the bonds of hellish darkness, clearly refers to the story of the watchman from the Book of Enoch. This tradition about fallen angels, developed in detail in the apocryphal text, becomes part of the New Testament understanding of the origin of evil. All these parallels raise an important question. If the Book of Enoch had such a profound influence on the formation of New Testament thought, if it was quoted and used by the closest disciples of Christ, why did it not enter the canon? The answer to this question will lead us to one of the most dramatic chapters in the history of early Christianity. Enoch, being a man pleasing to God, was taken, and his trace is not found, because God moved him, wrote Clement of Alexandria at the end of the 2nd century, quoting the apocryphal text with the same reverence as the canonical scriptures. His contemporary Tertullian went even further, calling the Book of Enoch the most ancient prophetic writing and defending its authenticity from critics. In the first 3 centuries of Christianity, the attitude of church teachers to the Book of Enoch was surprisingly warm. Justin Martyr, in his Conversations with Tryphon the Jew, referred to the Enochian tradition about fallen angels as an explanation of the origin of demons. Irenaeus of Lyons used images from the Book of Enoch in his arguments about eschatology. Even such a strict theologian as Origen, although he expressed doubts about the canonicity of the text, nevertheless seriously studied its content. What attracted these outstanding conditions in the apocryphal text? First of all, its antiquity and closeness to the biblical tradition. The Book of Enoch explained mysterious places in the scriptures, revealed the background of brief mentions of fallen angels and giants. She proposed a coherent cosmology and eschatology, answered questions about the nature of evil and the fate of the righteous. In addition, the Enochian tradition perfectly fit into the apocalyptic mood of the early church. Christians of the first centuries lived in anticipation of the soon return of Christ, and the Book of Enoch with its prophecies about the coming judgment, seemed especially relevant to them. Martyrs in Roman prisons found consolation in promises of just retribution, and missionaries used vivid images of Enochian visions in their sermons. However, already in the 3rd to 4th centuries, the situation began to change. Bishop Philastrius of Brescia included belief in the authenticity of the Book of Enoch in the list of heresies. Hieronymus Stridonsky, the translator of the Vulgate, spoke about it with obvious mistrust. Augustine of Hippo, formulating the principles of selection of canonical books, directly excluded apocryphal texts from among divinely inspired writings. What has changed? Why did the text, which was revered as sacred for 3 centuries, suddenly become perceived as suspicious? The answer lies in the deep transformations that the Church experienced during the era of transformation from a persecuted sect into the state religion of the Roman Empire. In 367 AD, Bishop Athanasius of Alexandria wrote an Easter epistle that forever changed the history of Christianity. In it, for the first time, he provided an accurate list of the 27 books of the New Testament, the same list that we use today. About the Book of Enoch and other apocrypha, he wrote briefly and clearly, "Let no one add anything to them, and do not subtract anything from them." But how did it get to this point? What forces led to the fact that the text, which was quoted by the apostles and revered by the church fathers, ended up outside the sacred canon? The process of formation of the biblical canon was not a one-time act. It was a long evolution that spanned several centuries. In the first centuries of Christianity, there was no consensus on what book should be considered divinely inspired. Different churches used different collections of texts, and the boundaries of the sacred corpus remained blurred. However, by the 4th century, the situation changed dramatically. The church received state support, and it faced the task of creating a unified doctrine for the entire empire. In these conditions, issues of canonization acquired political importance. It was necessary to clearly define which texts reflect the true faith and which can lead believers astray. Strict criteria were developed to solve this problem. First, the apostolic origin. The book must have been written by the apostle or his immediate disciple. Secondly, compliance with the rule of faith. The content of the text should not contradict the main Christian dogmas. Thirdly, wide recognition. The book was to be used in worship by the majority of churches. By all these criteria, the Book of Enoch failed. Its author was not an apostle, but an Old Testament figure, which made it an anachronism. Her doctrine of fallen angels and detailed descriptions of the heavenly hierarchy seemed too fantastical for the emerging orthodoxy. And most importantly, by the 4th century, it was no longer used in the worship of most Christian communities. The decisive role was played by local councils, especially the council in Laodicea, circa 363. They not only excluded the Book of Enoch from the canon, but also prohibited the reading of non-canonical texts in churches. The era of the open canon has ended. The era of strict boundaries and clear definitions has begun. While the Roman Empire was deciding the fate of sacred texts in the marble halls of cathedrals, something completely different was happening in the distant mountains of Ethiopia. There, in the ancient monasteries of the Aksum Kingdom, monks continued to copy and study the Book of Enoch, as if no one had declared it apocryphal. For them, it remained a part of the sacred canon, and it remains to this day. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church is unique in many respects, but especially in its relationship to the biblical canon. Her Old Testament includes 81 books against 39 in the Protestant tradition, and among these additional books is the full text of the Book of Enoch. This is the only Christian tradition in the world that officially recognizes the Enochian writings as divinely inspired. How did it happen? The history of Christianity in Ethiopia began very early, already in the 4th century, thanks to the missionary activity of Saints Frumentius and Odysseus. But the geographical isolation of the country, surrounded by Muslim states, led to the fact that the Ethiopian Church developed largely independently of Byzantine and Roman influences. When texts were canonized in other parts of the Christian world, the Ethiopians kept more archaic traditions. A key role was played by the translation of the Bible into Ge'ez, the ancient Ethiopian language. This translation was made from the Greek Septuagint and included many books that were subsequently excluded from the canon in other traditions. The Book of Enoch was translated from Greek, which, in turn, was translated from the Aramaic original and became an integral part of the Ethiopian Bible. In Ethiopian monasteries, the Book of Enoch was not only preserved, but actively studied and commented upon. Ethiopian theologians created an extensive literature interpreted on Enochian texts. Images and motifs from the Book of Enoch entered Ethiopian church poetry, iconography, and liturgy. The Feast of Enoch is still celebrated in the Ethiopian church calendar. Thanks to this tradition, the complete text of the Book of Enoch in Ge'ez came down to us, the only complete version of this ancient work in the world. All other traditions have preserved only fragments or translations from Ethiopic. Ethiopia became the custodian of the text that the rest of the Christian world decided to forget. Today, the Ethiopian tradition reminds us that the history of Christianity is much more complex and diverse than it is commonly thought. Decisions made in one part of the Christian world were not necessarily made everywhere. In 1773, the Scottish researcher James Bruce returned from a dangerous trip to Ethiopia with 3 manuscripts that shook the European scientific world. Among them was a complete copy of the Book of Enoch in ancient Ge'ez, the first complete text of this work that Europe has seen in 1,500 years. The scientists could not believe their eyes. The legendary book, known only by quotations and fragments, resurrected before them in its entirety. Bruce's discovery launched a real revolution in biblical studies. For the first time, it became possible to study the full text of the work, which had such a profound effect on the formation of the Judeo-Christian tradition. German, French, and English scholars rushed to translate and comment on the ancient text. The first critical editions appeared. A serious study of Enochian literature began. But the real breakthrough occurred in the 20th century. The discovery of the Qumran manuscripts in 1947 not only confirmed the antiquity of the Book of Enoch, but also showed its enormous influence on Judaism of the Second Temple era. More copies of Enochian texts were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls than any other non-canonical book. This meant that the Book of Enoch was one of the most popular religious works of its time. Archaeological findings completely changed the scientific understanding of early Judaism and Christianity. It became clear that the Enochian tradition was not marginal sectarian literature, but mainstream religious thought. Many ideas that were considered specifically Christian, the concept of the Messiah as the eternal Son of Man, detailed descriptions of the afterlife, developed angelology, turned out to have roots in the Enochian tradition. Modern methods of textology made it possible to trace the complex history of the creation and transmission of Enochian texts. It turned out that the name Book of Enoch hides a whole library of works created at different times by different authors. Scientists have learned to distinguish the layers of the text to determine the dates of creation of individual parts. To reconstruct the history of the development of the Enochian tradition, today the Book of Enoch is at the center of international research projects. Critical editions are created on the basis of all available manuscripts. New translations are developed. Conferences and symposia are held. The text, which was once excluded from the canon as dangerous, is now recognized as one of the key sources for understanding the religious history of mankind. Concluding our journey along the winding paths of the history of the Book of Enoch, we are faced with an important question. What can this history tell us about the nature of religious tradition, about the mechanisms of preservation and loss of sacred texts, about how the collective memory of mankind is formed? The fate of the Book of Enoch is a story about how historical circumstances can radically change the perception of religious heritage. A text that has been revered as sacred for centuries can be declared apocryphal. A work that influenced the formation of fundamental religious ideas may be consigned to oblivion. Conversely, lost texts can be resurrected centuries later and change our understanding of the past. This story also shows us the relativity of canonical boundaries. What one tradition considers sacred, another may reject. Decisions made by church councils 1,500 years ago do not necessarily reflect the original intentions of the authors or the initial perception of the texts. The canon is not a given, but the result of a historical process in which theological, political, and cultural factors were intertwined. It is especially important that the history of the Book of Enoch reminds us of the diversity of early Christianity. The church of the first centuries was much more pluralistic than we are used to thinking. There were various traditions, various ways of understanding faith, various collections of sacred texts. The victorious orthodoxy represented only one of many opportunities for the development of Christian thought. Modern discoveries in the field of biblical archaeology and textology continue to reveal new facets of this diversity. We learn about currents and traditions that were once excluded from official history. We understand that the way of formation of religious traditions was much more complicated and dramatic than it seemed before. The Book of Enoch teaches us also to appreciate the role of marginal traditions in the preservation of cultural heritage. If not for the Ethiopian church, we would never have known the full text of this outstanding work. The periphery sometimes turns out to be the custodian of what the center decides to discard. Finally, this story reminds us of the importance of an open and critical study of religious heritage. Only free research allows us to see a complete picture of the past and understand the present in all its complexity and contradictions.